For such a tired group of people on Friday, there seems to be a lot of energy in this room. We appreciate you coming out. There was some confusion as to whether or not this was a meeting that everyone was required to attend. I think we made it pretty clear in the email that we thought it'd be a great idea for you to attend. There are a lot of changes on the horizon that we all need to be aware of. We're still absorbing about 50 pages of the Cliff Notes on the new legislation that we'll be facing as early as this fall when we return to school. So we felt it would be a great idea to get together to share what we've learned about the legislation so that as you are going through the summer months preparing for the next school year, you'll understand our situation in terms of some of the major things that we'll be facing. We have with us today, Sue DeMonico is going to handle the slide presentation. We have Michelle Cook here, who has been instrumental on the Education Committee throughout the process. We are learning as we go along. Of course, Cheryl Klocko is here, and I saw her upright and greeting people at the door, which is an accomplishment. I know what kind of weekend she had. But thank you for being here. I hope this is informative. We are going to try to keep this within our promised hour because I know that everybody has things to do back at their buildings, their classrooms, and so on and so forth. So we'll keep it brief. We will not do a question and answer for a couple of reasons. Number one, we don't have all the answers yet. But we will take, Michelle Cook kindly said that if we get out her email address, she would be happy to entertain questions via email throughout the summer as you learn more about this.
I ask for cards.
You like that?
Oh, we're handing out cards. Michelle, you may be sorry about this. I don't know. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Sue DeMonico again. Thanks for being here, and bear with us as we make our way through this legislation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. As Bill mentioned earlier, the original legislation, SB 458, was over 165 pages and has been reduced to a 45-page Cliff Notes from the OLR budget analysis, and I've tried to reduce it to about 20 slides to share some critical information with you this morning. So let's go ahead and get started.
So if they're online, if anybody has a device with them, we can give them the website where they can.
Right, the presentation you're about to see, I'll mention this again at the end, is on the Torrington Public Schools website under Educational Services, under Education Reform. So we'll go over a couple of different places where you can locate information, the same information from this source and from other sources at the end if you want to try to make some sense of it yourself. But let's go ahead and start with the presentation. I started by sharing with you the 6 guiding principles that Governor Malloy mentioned when he was here on his education reform tour with the commissioner and his staff back in the spring. You'll notice that the first one deals with access to high-quality early childhood opportunities, and that talks about preschool slots that are available. For each one of these, I'm going to be giving you more information about some of the details that are embedded in them and how they're going to affect us in Torrington. The second one deals with interventions and supports for Connecticut's lowest performing schools. The good news is that we are not one of the Commissioner's Alliance districts. Those are the 30 worst performing school districts in the state of Connecticut. And Torrington is probably lodged somewhere firmly in the center. This information is based almost entirely on standardized test scores like CMT and CAPT. But there are some districts that are in close proximity to us, I believe, possibly Winsted and Ansonia, Naugatuck, Waterbury, others that fall into this category. And for the teachers and staff in those districts, their life is going to be very, very different. The third point addresses resources being targeted to districts with the greatest need, provided they follow the embrace the key reforms. A lot of this legislation is built on research and best practices in education and practices that are in place in other states. practices that have been developed by educational researchers. And in other words, there's money that's available, but there are strings attached. You're not just being given a blanket grant and saying, use this money in whichever way you think is going to best advantage your school district. The fourth bullet deals with the availability of high-quality school models, including traditional comprehensive schools, but with a greater emphasis on magnet schools, charter schools, and other types of configurations. There are some points in the legislation that specifically address the vocational agriculture schools and the Connecticut Technical High School system as well. And so in this legislation, you're going to see some provisions that make some types of funding available to district-based charters and magnets, which may have some implications for us, as you'll see. The fifth key principle is to try to remove red tape and other barriers to success. The emphasis is primarily on higher performing districts, but this also does have some implications for us, as you'll see. Some of you may have heard about the end of CEUs, continuing education units in the state of Connecticut. And as of July 1 this year, 2012, just a couple weeks from now, if you need to renew your professional certificate, you will not need to attest to the fact that you have earned a specific number of CEUs in order to be able to renew your certificate. Those of you who renewed this year, yes, you did. But going forward after July 1, that will not be necessary. There are still provisions within the legislation, however, that require the district to continue to provide professional learning, professional training in some specific areas. And there still are some provisions within the legislation that have the same requirements that were embedded in the CEU, especially for early childhood educators. There are still requirements for 15 hours of training in literacy and 15 hours of training in technology and computer use in the classroom for all teachers. But we'll deal with that a little bit more as we go along. The sixth principle is probably the one that was the most contentious throughout the governor's tour. And it does have very specific implications for us in Torrington. And that is to ensure that our schools are home for the very best teachers and principals and administrators in general, working within a fair system that values skills and effectiveness. So this is the provision where the legislation deals with tenure, with termination, with professional development, and a number of other issues. Okay, so for the first principle, early childhood. Districts around the state are grouped into different categories, and Torrington is considered to be a competitive district. So although there are 1,000 seats that are provided, 1,000 preschool seats that are provided for in the legislation, only 250 of those seats are available to competitive districts. And so Torrington will have some share of those 250 seats. Cheryl, approximately how many?
We could have up to 30.
Okay, as many as 30 preschool slots would be funded by the state through this legislation for Torrington Public Schools. The legislation also requires a facilities study to be conducted for looking at possibilities for expanding early childhood opportunities, for tiered quality rating and improvement system for various preschool providers, whether they're home, center, or school-based. So they're raising the qualifications, upping the ante on the quality of the preschool experience that our students have access to. Legislation provides for a pilot study to promote best practices in early literacy. So work will be done over the course of the next probably 3 years to determine models and make suggestions about providing early care. This is one that's going to have a pretty big impact. A new statewide reading assessment is going to be developed for our students in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. This is an expansion of the state's current assessment system, which really doesn't kick into gear until CMTs in third grade. But now the state will be providing a new reading assessment for our youngest students in order to determine their student strengths and weaknesses in terms of their literacy skills. The state is also embarking on developing a reading plan. Typically, plans are done at the school level, perhaps at the district level. We're now seeing that responsibility assumed at the state level for a best practice research-based reading plan. And in conjunction with that, the creation of an intensive reading instruction program. So basically what's happening is the state, in some cases, is going to be taking some decisions away from districts and schools regarding the best practices that should be employed in order to improve early literacy. So what is the impact for us in the Torrington Public Schools? All certified employees, teachers, principals, special educators, ESL teachers who are working in grades kindergarten through 3 must take and are expected to pass a State Board of Education approved practice reading exam. Okay. What's the reason for doing that? In one of the stories that I heard about this doesn't prove that you can or are not able to teach reading, but what it does do is it does demonstrate that educators who hold those very, very important foundational education positions have foundational knowledge of all of the components and practices that are associated with literacy instruction. Those of you who are very new to teaching may be familiar with the fact that I think it was in 2009, pre-service teachers were required to take a literacy test as part of their educational program. And now this practice that has been in place for our pre-service teachers is being expanded to our in-service teachers. The state-developed professional development plan will be based on reading assessment data. Remember, we said they're going to implement a new test, K-3. The results of that data will be entered into the PSIS, into the State Student Information System. There are going to be some expansions to that system as well. And based on patterns of student performance, the state's professional development plan will suggest activities to address students' strengths and weaknesses in early literacy. It will be differentiated to meet different teachers' needs. I think there's one thing that's an overwhelming theme in the legislation, and that is that professional development needs to be differentiated to the same degree that we expect to differentiate instruction for our students. That many teachers are in many different places in terms of their background education, their previous classwork they've conducted in literacy instruction, and so on. So the professional development needs to be differentiated as well. As part of this process, the state would like to identify in-service teachers who can act as mentor teachers, who have the skill, the ability, the knowledge, the motivation to assist their peers in improving their practice. It will establish a vision for a model classroom. So in other words, you'll be inundated perhaps, but you'll certainly have a vision shared with you about what should be occurring for literacy instruction in classrooms. The idea is for the professional development to be as job embedded as possible. And that can be conducted in a number of ways. That will be left to the discretion of the districts, whether we're talking about classroom walkthroughs, instructional rounds, mentoring, peer coaching, peer assistance, lots of different models we can look at, but to be able to work with teachers who are in the classroom doing the practice. And also, the final point of this is that all of this research and all of these models will help better inform principals so that they are knowing what they are looking for, what constitutes good instruction, and will be able to offer effective feedback to teachers in order to improve performance. Moving on to the second guiding principle about the intensive interventions. There is a commissioner's network of the 25 lowest performing schools, and actually the Alliance, which is a slightly different term, which is one I'm still trying to make the connection between the network and the Alliance, does contain 30 schools. In those schools, the school and the district will be required to establish turnaround committees, and they may have to follow an imposed plan. Some of you may be familiar with the interventions that are taking place in the eastern part of the state, where a special master has been assigned to, well, is it Willimantic? Which? Wyndham, the Wyndham Public Schools. And essentially, all the rules were suspended, and decisions were being made by the master. Dr. Adamowski was pressed into service for this, to make some very, very drastic changes in the way in which business was done in the school system. Schools can, in some cases, if they're not showing improvement, be turned over to outside school operators in up to 6 of these districts. And once again, this doesn't affect us directly, but it shows you the severity of some of these changes. That we could have schools that are run by organizations like Edison and other groups that are outside of the normal public school system. Some of you also may recall the press coverage of the Bridgeport Board of Education being removed and then eventually reinstated. This is the degree of change that this legislation is making possible. That if there's not significant change, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're always going to get what you always got. And so things need to be done in a fundamentally different way. Yeah, let me just share the clarification that Michelle has made. We're going to address this a little bit later on, but there's a school index and there's a district index. So much of this legislation applies specifically to a single school. They're not talking about the whole district. So if you have a different level of performance across, particularly the larger urban districts, where you have some schools that are doing very, very well and some schools that are struggling, it is those schools that are lower on the school performance index that will be targeted, not necessarily a whole district takeover. Thank you. School status. This is addressing the point that I just made. There will be a school performance index. Right now, if you were to go online and check out some of the websites that rank schools, that tend to be attached to real estate companies and other public interest types of organizations, you will see that Torrington, as I said, is probably pretty comfortably in the middle of this group. We're not at the top, we're not at the bottom. But the School Performance Index will be using primarily state assessment data to rank schools. Just as Connecticut Magazine does, they use SATs and CAP scores. They're a snapshot, they're an index. They're not necessarily the whole picture, but this information will be used to rank schools. Student weighted performance on the mastery test, reading, writing, math and science, weighted achievement growth, graduation and dropout rates will be part of this. And then there will be some alternative, I think, that is still yet to be decided in terms of a data point to be used for secondary schools if the data is not available. Okay, so once again, it doesn't tell the whole picture, but the same information would be collected for every school across every district. Schools will be ranked into 5 categories. Category 1 and Category 2 are obviously the desirable higher categories. Category 3 is when certain interventions begin to kick in. Category 3s may be required to do the list of things that are mentioned up there, including more articulation with early childhood opportunities, something Torrington does very well, to offer summer school, to offer extended day programs, which we already have in place in our elementary schools, but should we fall into Category 3, we would likely be required to expand. Potentially weekend classes, expansion of tutoring services, and specific targeted PD. Okay, so none of that sounds too bad. Those are all things that we have our toe in the water already to some degree. Legislation is not clear on the source of funding that would make some of these items available at this point. Okay, so I think it's more clear for the Commissioners Network and for the Alliance schools. There is $50 million, $37.5 million of which is directed towards those schools that would make these things possible. But I think we would all agree that some of these solutions would be effective in helping us to resolve some of our gaps in background knowledge of some of our struggling learners. Categories 4 and 5. More and more local discretion begins to evaporate once you get into these higher levels of intervention. These would include both operational and instructional and curricular audits, required improvement plans that would need to be filed with the state, the state having greater discretion to direct the use of state and federal funds. In other words, you're receiving Title I money, you will use it for extended day programs, you will use it for expansion of tutoring perhaps, it's just as an example. Incentives to attract high quality staff, and that may be monetary incentives, and it may include pre-service teachers who are at the top of their graduating classes from teacher preparation programs in state colleges and universities, but it also might be incentives for in-service staff to be willing to accept assignments in schools where students are struggling. On a very severe note, it could include the reconstitution or transfer of staff. Some of you may be familiar with that from Rhode Island, where entire school staff, faculty were terminated and then had to reapply for their jobs in order to be set back into the school. The establishment of model curriculum. There are already some samples. There is a model Algebra 1 curriculum, for example, that has been in development in the state of Connecticut over the last several years. You could be required to implement that curriculum as opposed to having that as an option. And another possible intervention is to require schools to break into smaller learning communities or academies, so a school within a school, or to offer other educational options. There's more. For Category 4 and 5 schools, it looks like there's going to be expanded opportunities for inter-district school choice, to have the opportunity to attend schools in other jurisdictions. You know that in Connecticut legislation, schools are districted by their municipality, and that's been in place since 1904 or something like that. So there's a possibility that that may be on the agenda. The commissioner can also be involved in the appointment of a superintendent or a special master, as we mentioned in Wyndham. It may involve asking the union to reopen the contract to revise employment conditions, particularly if you're looking at extended day opportunities, expedited arbitration to allow for the implementation of improvement plans, possibly required school governance councils, possibly reconstituted school boards in order to be able to implement change of this magnitude. We mentioned some of the funding. The education cost sharing grant is going to be increased by a very, very significant amount. There is a realization on the part of the legislature that these changes do have price tags attached to them. And so in order to make some of these changes possible, additional funding will be available, particularly to the Alliance districts and to the Commissioners Network. We did get, how much?
$168,600 and change.
Okay, almost $500,000 of that money was able to come to us to help with our budget for the upcoming year. There will be accountability for the low-performing districts. In other words, it's not a blanket grant. There will be strings attached. There will be direction on how the funds are to be spent. And another aspect of this, and this item could also fall under the red tape guiding principle, but the development of a common chart of accounts as a budgetary template. Currently, all of the districts in the state of Connecticut have to file a form after the end of each fiscal year, which reports their expenditures to the state and how their funds were utilized. This is going to put everyone into the same accounting format to allow for better comparability, to see where funds are going, how they're being spent, to see if there are patterns that are more effective than others. Next point is about school models. The legislation does increase funding for charter schools. And this is, in some ways, you've heard the phrase, the money follows the child. There will be options for additional financial incentives to start up charters and to allow students per pupil expenditure to follow the student to the new school in order to provide programming. The legislation expands the efforts of charters to serve priority school populations. So there are some charters that will be designed specifically to meet the needs of English language learners, dual language programs, special education, minority and special needs students. In some cases, charters in the past have been highly selective. And part of the reason some people have said that they've been so successful is they can decide who crosses the threshold and who's educated within the charter schools. And this begins to break down those walls and look at a more open enrollment type of model for those schools that are receiving the special funding. There are incentives to boards of education to start up and operate in-district charters and magnets. There is more funding that's being made available to the ag science schools and vocational technical schools, but also with the same provisions that we mentioned, that there is a more open, not a more open enrollment.
VOAGs and VOTEX will stay.
Okay, they'll stay the same.
Always going to be an application process.
Okay, I was corrected on that. There will always be some sort of application process for the special schools.
The VOAGs and the VOTEX.
Just the VOAGs and the VOTEX. And one thing that will impact us is that we will have to publicize various school choice options on our website. I think our students are already very cognizant of what their choices are, but now as probably a tab on our website, we'll need to make sure that families and students are available. In fact, they have options other than to attend the community comprehensive high school. There are a number of turnaround school models that are mentioned within the legislation. The compact schools, which are run in cooperation with the University of Connecticut. They're in some ways kind of professional development lab schools. The social development model, schools that are run by RESPs like CREC or Education Connection or ACES. And then also school reorganization that might include themed academies, possibly required block scheduling, and more frequent student assessment. And I think what you'll see once the smarter balanced assessments become available in 2015, this sort of culture of formative assessment, the use of online assessment is going to be much more pervasive than it is today. Under removing red tape, which I think is probably the fourth of the bullets that I mentioned, low-performing schools may offer employment to top students in teacher education programs earlier in the hiring season. You may or may not be aware of the fact that because of the budget process in some Connecticut districts, they don't know whether they're going to have money available and very often have to hold off on hiring decisions and consequently may lose very highly qualified candidates that they want to have in their district because the candidates want to be sure they have a job to go to and the districts can't make a financial commitment to say that that's going to happen for sure. So this is an attempt to make sure that districts can secure and offer contracts to these highly qualified teacher candidates to make sure to get them on board. Category 1 and 2 schools, remember those are the two top performing ones, may be excused from some data collection and some reports that normally have to go into the state. There is a red tape task force that is being convened, I think now as we speak, to take a look at some of the areas where we can reduce some of the data collection that's currently required. That's already in the works, I believe. I think it has nine constituents on it, so out on the news. Okay, now the last one, which is a very loaded, very important topic for us, is to look at attempts that are being made to assure quality teachers and principals. There are going to be, even though we went through some changes in our district within the past 2 years in terms of the revision of our teacher evaluation plan, it is going to change again. Because now our teacher evaluation plan does have to be aligned with the recommendations that have been made by the PEAK Commission, which is the Performance Evaluation Advisory Council. The PEAK group has been in place for about 3 years, but has really only been very, very active within about the past 6 to 9 months. And they have issued a number of guidelines that are going to impact states, all the districts across the state. In our current teacher evaluation plan, for those of you who are in the comprehensive cycle, your performance is judged either to meet standards or needs improvement. This is going to be expanded from those 2 categories to the 4 categories that you see listed up there: exemplary, proficient, developing, and below standard. For those teachers who are in the developing or below standard, a remediation plan will be required as part of this teacher evaluation overhaul. A new evaluation system is being piloted. Originally it was said 8 to 10 districts. Those district names were released within the past couple of weeks. There are some districts that applied as partners. So, for example, I think Litchfield and Region 6 are together as one entity in there. But these districts will be piloting new teacher evaluation plans that are consistent with the PEAK recommendations. And as we mentioned before, there will be the elimination of the current system of CEUs, but there are still guidelines for professional development in which job-embedded coaching is encouraged to be the primary form of training. A topic that was controversial throughout the development of the legislation was the topic of tenure. And tenure will be based on effective practice, not specifically numbers of years of service. Used to be very narrow definitions by which a teacher could be dismissed from the position. Now effectiveness will be added to that category. Effectiveness is going to be determined by our own teacher evaluation plan. So it's very important to look carefully at those data points that we use to determine whether or not a teacher is effective. There are considerably shortened timelines for terminating teachers who are determined to be ineffective. The state is also talking about utilizing outside validators, as they are doing in New Haven currently, to review the performance of those teachers who are considered to be the most effective or the least effective, just as a check to be sure that everyone is using the same standard for performance. And in addition to the regular ratings that are established by the districts, there will be a state-level distinguished educator designation that I believe can be part of your certificate if you meet certain criteria. A few other items. There is an increase in the number of family resource centers and school-based health clinics for those districts that are in the Alliance. For Torrington, we have already, on our own, actively pursued many of these community partnerships. And so, in some respects, we're a little bit ahead of the curve there. The legislation adds a physical exercise requirement for students in grades K through 5. This is in addition to physical education classes and recess time. But they're recognizing the importance of student activity and their attempts to address childhood obesity. So active physical time. And I know from visiting classrooms around the district that many of you build in that motor skills time and active time into your instruction already. So, but we're going to need to take a look at what we're going to need to do in order to meet this requirement. There's also funding that's becoming available as part of the municipal aid for new teachers. Remember, we mentioned earlier that there will be grants that will allow districts to hire top graduates from our state colleges and universities. The Open Choice program is going to have additional program incentives. For those of you who are not familiar with Open Choice, Torrington is not a chef district, but dating back to the late 1980s, there was a monumental court case that was decided primarily in reference to the Hartford Public Schools and the surrounding suburban districts that have made it possible for students who reside in Hartford to apply to attend school in some of the suburban districts that surround the city of Hartford. And those designated so-called chef districts, named after the plaintiff, have been accepting students, usually in relatively small numbers. I think the largest percentage were 2 to 3% of their student population. But there will be additional incentives for those districts to accept more students from out of district from Hartford. There will be a study of small district issues. In fact, there will be some penalties attached to districts that wish to continue to exist if they serve fewer than 1,000 students. There's some threshold at which the state is trying to discourage municipalities from maintaining their own district and trying to encourage regionalization. And there will be an extension of the minimum budget requirement, which from our point of view is a very good thing because it gives us some idea of stability and funding from the state. The last couple of slides, what I've tried to do is try to break things out by when they go into effect. And these are some of the things that we will be dealing with in a couple of weeks, starting July 1st. Some of these may not affect Torrington directly, but these are elements of the legislation that are going into effect in the first year. The family resource centers and school-based health clinics, the choice incentives, the establishment of the school performance indices, the identification and hiring of turnaround plan referees, school governance councils, new charters, teacher evaluation plans being piloted, and the development of the intensive reading instruction program. So these are some items that will be in the works, effective immediately. Next year, the list gets longer. It's probably so small that those of you in the back of the room can't read the print. But beginning July 1, 2013, these are some of the provisions of the legislation that will be in effect. The new school readiness program spaces, the early childhood facility study, the quality rating and improvement system for our early care providers, the literacy pilot extension, the new statewide reading assessments will go into effect in the following school year, not the upcoming one, but the following school year. The professional development and reading plan, the uniform system of accounting, the small district issues, the provisions that are associated with the alliance districts, changes in professional development, the ECS, the MBR, the grant increases, the per student grant for VOAG, the K-3 reading program, the requirement to pass the reading instruction, the foundational literacy test, and a pre-literacy course developed. So you can see in 2013, there are quite a few things that are going to begin to impact us on the local level. 2014, okay, 2 years out, is when we begin to collect data on the teacher reading exam, the municipal aid for the new teachers, more on the commissioners network specifically, more funding issues, the charter school opt-out lottery study, the NEAG study of the teacher evaluation pilot program, evaluation training for new evaluation plans that will be going into effect, the State Department of Education audit of evaluation systems related to teacher evaluation, changes in the timelines for teacher tenure and termination, and the summer school and extended day grant phase out for former priority school districts. Some of you may have heard recently in the news what was going on in Ansonia, where a number of positions had to be eliminated because of their loss of priority school money because of their overall improvement. So we're taking a look at that going forward. 2015 and beyond, expanded classroom experience for teachers who are currently involved in teacher preparation programs. There is a P20 council that has been convened that's been bringing together representatives from local school districts and representatives from higher education and representatives from the State Department of Education, who are looking at teacher preparation programs that are currently in place to determine whether they are effective in preparing teachers to be effective once they leave the university and gain employment at the district level. And then also the professional educator certificate changes. We'll go on to the next one. We're not done yet. Go on to the next slide. There were a number of other things that were included within the legislation where there are not a very specific implementation date set to them. And I won't read through the list. If you want to take a look at that, like I said, it's on the website. You can take a closer look at it. But many of these things are things that were mentioned in the previous slides. And they just don't have a specific date attached to them. But will be probably implemented as soon as possible by districts that have the capacity to do so. To get more information, if you'd like to review this presentation and other presentations that I've pulled from the legislative review packet and from the legislation, I have one on professional development, one on teacher tenure and termination, one on teacher evaluation. All of these PowerPoints can be located on our district website under the Educational Services tab. Look under Education Reform. The State Department of Education has also created its own very professionally done PowerPoint that addresses these changes. It is organized in the same way according to the 6 guiding principles. It's a little bit fancier and busier, so it really wasn't appropriate to just take it offline and just share that with you this morning. But if you'd like to take a look at it, that is located at the State Department of Education website. When you go to their homepage, it's listed under recent happenings right on the homepage, so you can click on a link for it there. And then also, if you want to go right to the source, you're welcome to visit the Connecticut General Assembly website. This is a bill status one that I use as a quick link, but there are other ways that you can find this information, and maybe Michelle can tell you a little bit more about that. I think that's it. Can you click on the next one? I think. Okay, so that's the short version of the long bill. So I'm going to turn things over to Cheryl, or Michelle at this point. Let Cheryl share some information with you. Thank you.
You're probably wondering why this morning. This wasn't a mandated meeting, but we thought with such complicated things coming out of the state, when you come back, there may be changes. And, you know, say, well, gee, we never heard about it. So now you're hearing about it. You need to be informed. Our public schools will be quite different from how we've known them. And so what I wanted to share a little bit with you this morning of how this educational reform law can impact Torrington Public Schools. And this is, again, a quick blush. But before I say that, I just wanted, for those who are here from the high school, that was an amazing graduation last night. It had, as I saw many of you as I came in, we all kind of said, that was a great graduation. And it was, and it had the great balance for having student ownership and a little bit of the pomp and circumstance that we all folks knew. So really, kudos to the high school for doing a great job for their students. I hope you'll bear with me because I went home and did this last night. So you're sitting there thinking, I've heard all of this before, and for most of the part, if you've been in education as long as I have, and this is my 39th year, you can sit there and you can tell me, you know, I've heard it all before. Torrington has had a district-wide and school improvement plan. We've designed a teacher evaluation plan with SMART goals that are connected to student achievement. We've developed a data system to monitor student progress on the elementary level. We've made and implemented a transition plan from pre-K to K, 5 to 6, and 8 to 9. We know how to differentiate instruction and adapt learning activities for students with special needs and for students who are learning English as a second language, and we implement these instructional strategies on a daily basis in our classrooms. You can tell me that you have seen the pendulum swing from one education philosophical belief to the next and back again. Yes? For us oldies, but goodies. The difference now is that as a district, we, and I do mean we, teachers, administrators, and support staff, excuse me, must prioritize our practices with evidence of success in raising achievement and closing gaps. We have to prove that what and how we are teaching will and does lead to student academic success. Recommended strategies from the Connecticut State Department of Education include differentiating supports and interventions to schools within the district based on student learning needs, employing academic interventions with individual students that target rapid, and I repeat, rapid improvement, such as extended learning time, early literacy and remediation, dropout prevention, and benchmark assessments, and developing talent and development and evaluation systems that strengthen teaching and leadership abilities among educators. In order to make this happen, we have our work cut out for us. And I'm giving you, this is the superintendent's bird's eye view of the school district. As much as I try to stay, on the ground and look at our schools from teachers' perspective, I also have to look at it from the superintendent's perspective. I'm learning. Isn't that pretty good for somebody who's 60 years old? In order to make this happen, I said, we have it cut out for us. Last year, not one school in the district made AYP. Our dropout rate remains one of the highest in the state at 22%. And the entering 9th grade for 2012 has had 25% of the class identified to be at risk to achieve expected academic benchmarks and dropping out of school. Our overall school population is at risk because 55% of the student population qualifies for free and reduced lunch. 116 students remain homeless. 338 are learning English as a second language, and 800 plus require special education support services. But these cannot be excuses for why students do not achieve academic success and meet mandated learning outcomes. Between Torrington Middle School and Torrington High School, 23 students were expelled for either bringing a weapon to school because they felt unsafe and were bullied, or for possession or attempt to sell drugs because they needed money or they wanted to fit in with their peers. I know this because most of these students have been doing their coursework down at Midget Avenue. We call it Trob Prep, and in honor of our chairman of the board. Well, I've gotten to know these students really well this year, and you get to find out what's behind their behaviors. A total of 33 students at the secondary level were arrested either on campus or in incidents outside of the school, and several wound up in juvenile detention. This is the first year in Torrington's history that we overspent in our juvenile detention tuition line. But these cannot be excuses for why all our students do not meet academic achievement success. We lose approximately 100 students from the incoming 9th grade class each year because families are beginning to choose other learning environments for their children than a traditional high school. They are choosing schools which offer smaller learning communities with specific themes and provide their child with integrated learning experiences, opportunities to solve real-world problems, and to participate in internships and other options of work with practicing professionals. But again, this is not an excuse for why all our students do not achieve academic success. We must begin to look at the raw material with which we have to work, the students who cross the thresholds of our school buildings every day, and ask ourselves, where should we start? What has worked, and what do we need to change? We make no excuses as to why they cannot succeed, and we must try everything in our power and use the knowledge and our collective wisdom and experience we have as educators to to design what a quality learning environment entails and how it must be implemented for a diverse group of learners. We must offer all students a learning environment that actively engages them through questioning, allows opportunity for peer discussions, and provides time for research that is geared, again, toward real-life problems, as well as opportunities to work with the practicing professional. How can they decide where they would like to go? How can they create their path for a future life if they have no idea what's outside beyond these school walls? Students must understand the relationships that exist between the skills and strategies in content area courses and real-world application. We must hold high expectations for the students and for ourselves, because we are the model we hope that they will follow and emulate. We must provide a safe haven within our classrooms because learning, and that means for all of us, is a very risky business. In order to do this, we must know our students well. Be there for them, recognize them as individuals, and demonstrate that we are willing to listen. We must know their academic strengths and challenges and the intelligences through which they learn best, and then design lessons and learning tasks that support these strengths, challenges, and intelligences. Once we have this understanding of our students, we can help them plan their map for where they want to be academically a year from now, 4 years from now, for a lifetime. We will guide them to understanding what is important to achieve their goals and the possible paths to take them there. To do this, we must meet regularly as colleagues to discuss student progress and the roadblocks preventing them from achieving academic success. We must be strategic in our actions, measure the outcomes of our interventions, implemented and cast aside, not the students, but the implementations that do not work and keep those that do. There will be data to analyze and we move forward. This type of work takes time. It takes collegial relationships and it puts the student first, even before the grade level or content area we teach. What does this mean? It means change, that dirty, dirty word. Change is how we view ourselves as individual schools, change in how we view ourselves as individual schools and as a district. Faculties must examine the culture of their schools, what is most important to them, and how they will work together to make the culture work for the students who attend it. In the next week, I will be meeting with each administrator, and I will be asking them for their plans for the 2012-2013 school year that will improve the academic achievement of all students attending their schools. Their plans must include many items. Many of the items I mentioned here this morning, and others. Upon return to school in August, these plans will be formalized and ready to share with faculty, staff, families, and community. Education reform is here. We can embrace it and remain ahead of the curve in order to do it the way we believe it should be done, or we can say, this too shall pass, and ignore it, but eventually it will catch up with us, and the only ones who will lose will be the students. I have to believe that this is not what we want to happen for the students of Torrington or for this community. Thanks for indulging me.